dynamic expansions and retinal expression of spectrally distinct short wavelength opsin genes in sea snakes. Goodness gracious me. That is a title, right? That is a heckin' title. Well, it's not the worst title ever, right? You can see there's something to do with eyes, with the retinal component. Opsins are components of vision. Fruit flies have opsins. Snakes have opsins. It gives the ability to have color vision. But let's actually go into the abstract, and then I'll break down like what exactly this is meant to be analyzing. So photopigment encoding genes, that's what gives an animal the ability to see color, right? So having opsins means that you can have color perception, and there's different variation across different animals, giving you an ability to see different types of colors, right? So the way that you and I see the world is actually different from person to person. It's purple. No, it's lapis. No, it's this, it's that, it's that. Me, it's purple. She sees different things, right? There's variation in the ability for us to see different kinds of color, and these opsins are also different between different organisms, giving different animals the opportunity to see different types of colors. And so here, they're trying to analyze, well, what, if any, color vision there is in sea snakes. And so what they see is that there's certain sea snakes that have a duplicate of a genetic copy of one of these opsins. There's a duplicated version. So it says we generated one new genome, 45 resequencing data sets. So they've resequenced an entire genome, 10 retinal transcriptomes. What that means is they take 10 retinas and look and see what the RNA is in those retinas. Like what is on and off? What are the genes that are activated and deactivated in these retinas? And they compare all this data that they have alongside, they say, 16 existing genomes for sea snakes and their terrestrial relatives. So snakes that are land snakes. Okay. And what's really cool is that they find these, they say, 3 lineages having multiple intact SWS1 gene. The SWF1 is that short wavelength sensitive 1 opsin, that special color vision that they're interested in checking out. And so why does all this matter? Most sea snakes can't see color, right? So if they can't see color and these can see color, that must mean there's something unique about these sea snakes. And that, I think, is the really, really cool part of this study, where they looked at the visual function of these sea snakes. And so what they find is that this genetic trait is actually connected to the animals that they sequenced. Meaning that of the 9 sea snakes in, and I'll give y'all a map, this part of the world, in like Southeast Asia, Indonesia area, even on top of Australia, there are 9 species total that have this unique color vision. And this graph kind of breaks down which ones those are. And it's the ones where it's the F86 with the Y86. Those can see the additional types of color. And so it's a regaining of like color vision that normally they don't actually have. So snakes, so these are like terrestrial snakes. So the relatives of their corn relish is they came from a lizard-like ancestor that had all of the visual opsins that they needed because they lived in bright, colorful environments, right? If you live in bright, colorful areas, you need to be able to see color because it can inform you about the environment that you're in. However, so snakes descended from these animals that lived in these really colorful, bright habitats. Snakes, the earliest snakes, actually underwent this period of living in really, really dim lighting. And so they lost 2 opsin genes. The loss of those 2 genes meant that they lost a lot of the ability to distinguish colors. And it makes sense, right? You don't need to produce these proteins and have them running in your retina if you don't need them. If they're not going to contribute to anything in terms of your fitness, there's no reason to have them. And so these sea snakes have regained the ability genetically for advanced color vision. So this is why I thought this was really cool, is because you're going from like an evolutionary gene loss to then it being regained in a certain population of animals. And I just think that's really neat. And the way it was regained was a gene duplication event, then picked up a mutation. Now now they're able to see these colors again. What's interesting to note that in this paper, they don't know why. They know the genetic basis of how the vision was like, here are the genes that are different. Here is why that matters in terms of like its evolution, how it came to be. But what the purpose of having this color vision is, they don't know. And so they do mention in the paper that they need, the follow-up studies will need to be ones where we need to look at behavioral data to figure out what is the point of this increased color sensitivity. Those snakes are shallow coral reef inhabitants where there's more, maybe, Nilf. Maybe. So it's interesting, Neil, if we look at the paper itself, they go through a lot of just like the gene loss events, how the opsins work, the genetic sequencing that's been done, what the point of the opsins are, that gene loss has happened, the like evolutionary history of snakes. And then it just like, we really don't get a lot of the natural history, Neil, of like what these snakes actually doing. You know what I mean? Oh, there are all prime coral reef. Look, okay, cool. Like they're here. I'll do a quick control F in the paper. Yeah, there's coral and reef are not mentioned. I wonder if there's anything in the methods. The taxon sampling. They're found in wet markets, caught off the coast, euthanized prior to sampling. So see, Neil, like even in this description, or let's see, we can look in the extra supplementary material into the supplement. For example, like the collection timing, where it was collected, maybe even a map of the collection site, like a little bit more detailed than what we're seeing here. But it doesn't seem like it is. And the method just seems like it's supplementary data tables or data figures. But that is a really interesting point, Neil, on why maybe there is this extra visual repertoire that these snakes have. Let's go to the sea snakes, Corin, because you were asking earlier about the relationship between the sea snake versus the eel. That radiation is going to be from here too. So if we zoom in on the serpentines, if you will, that'll have a subdivision for the sea snakes. So they're not coming from, the eels are distinct. Like the ability in sea snakes to see. So here's the thing, y'all. Imagine if we had sequenced and studied these sea snakes first. We would be like, oh, snakes see color. That's interesting. But instead, the sea snakes we've been studying later on, and now we have a concept of where they fit in the genetic lineage, all of that. With that knowledge is why we know that it was a gene loss, and then they regained the ability to see color. Morris, I like Neil's hypothesis of maybe because the regions where they were found have a lot of color-rich coral reefs, and so it'd be a beneficial thing for them to have. Now, that isn't proven. They make a note of it in the paper that there needs to be behavioral testing to figure out what exactly they use it for. Because even if it's like color vision in the coral reef, is it for just sensory processing? Is it for hunting? Like, what is it that drives them to be able to see better? Like, why have that ability to see better? Which is something that, we don't yet know. It's just really interesting to go down that rabbit hole. Jay, great question, baby. So I really liked in the paper so this is in the journal of Genome Biology. And so it makes sense that all of the paper is basically just genetics that they're analyzing. Like, here is a ton of sequencing data, right? With this sequencing data, we're breaking down genes of interest. We're figuring out what those genes of interest might be doing in terms of what the animals now see, right? And that is now being able to see color. And then they say, we need follow-up studies where we can actually figure out what the point of it is. They not only sequence the whole genome, Jay, they resequence the genome. So this isn't a new species study. This is something where let's do some legitimate depth of the genetics of these animals. Yeah, so this is really cool, y'all. Like, from a evolutionary perspective and a genetic study, it's really cool. It's a really, really neat study. One thing, Jay, that they wanted to do, and they pointed out for future experiments, is testing out the behaviors in a lab setting and figuring out what is the benefit to this vision. And so what that'll actually entail, what was the sample size? In terms of how many individuals were sequenced, they did whole genome sequencing on a mix of several individuals. So whole genome sequencing at a really, really high depth is the pricey thing. So what you do, to build a reference genome, so something that you can compare against, you can pull together a couple of different samples, and that gets rid of like mutational variation and gives you like what is the actual answer. And so here, that's what they did. But then they also did retinal transcriptomics. So they took retinas, 10 different snakes, and did the RNA sequencing to figure out what is different in the retina, which is where these opsins are located that give them color vision. So multiple individuals tested. It's really, really cool stuff. It's really, really, really well done the way they did it. So the eye itself, Jay, structurally isn't very different. It is the cell types within the eye. So the opsins give the ability of animals to make distinguish different colors. And existing snakes have lost these opsins, to where if you don't have different opsins, you won't be able to see the differences in color. And so that's the important thing to note here. Structurally, the eye is going to remain the same, but on the genetic level, these opsins that contribute to the animal's ability to see different things, it's changed in the sea snakes, where there is a gene duplication event. So there was one gene that had one opsin, and that one opsin was like functional, but they can't really see color, which is what most terrestrial snakes do. They can't really see color. And then what you end up happening is that opsin duplicated. So in these sea snakes, they have more than one of these opsins. That opsin picked up a mutation, and when it picked up a mutation, it made it so that the color that opsin detects is different from the gene that it duplicated from. And having multiple opsins in your retina gives you the ability to differentiate different colors. If you only have that one, you can't, there's nothing to differentiate against. There's no telling the different wavelengths apart, so you can't see any differences in color. But the moment you have a gene duplication event happen, where that gene copies itself, and after it's copied itself, it picks up a mutation, that gives it the ability to see something different. Hope that makes sense, Jay. So like structurally, the eye isn't changing. It's the genetic composition of it. Is there a way to transfer the retina from one type of snake to the other, see color? So Jay, that is a very, very good question, especially the second part of that. I don't know if you can do a retinal transfer. However, Jay, if it's really just that one gene that is important, you can insert that gene into a land snake, right? If that one opsin is all you need, we can make a mutant snake with that extra gene. We can do that. But the second part of your question, Jay, is I think really, really critical. I do not know, and they mentioned none of it in the paper, of if there's gonna need to be different neurons that can process it, or is it as easy as I give you this option and it's functional? And Jay, it might be something where you cannot tell just from the sequencing. It might be something where you need to do the test of actually putting in that new genetic copy and seeing what happens. So like their follow-up study to this paper, the follow-up study that they said they want to do is behavioral analysis, to see what is the purpose of this color vision, right? If they have the ability to check color vision and see what the function is in the sea snake, like if we design a test, Jay, a behavioral test where you can tell now, okay, these sea snakes that we think genetically have the ability to see color, they pass a behavioral test, right? Now imagine that we give that gene to a land snake. Let's put it through the exact same behavioral test and see how it responds, right? It is, I think, if it's one of those situations where that one gene is enough, I can explain that away in that evolution where you lose neurons is a bit harder than evolution where you lose a gene that gives you ability to differentiate color. Because one is a structural reorganization of the brain, and the other is just color vision. And so it might be something where the neuronal system still is in place to be able to process this kind of information. That is a total hypothesis. I do not know, but that would be my guess if the experiment worked. If that gene was sufficient to give a land snake the ability to see color, it's presumed because the genetic structure that gives you neuronal structures and processing is similar enough where it just hasn't undergone enough evolutionary loss over time, is again my hypothesis on that front. And I'm tagging each of those because you never know, like I'm sure there could be some nuance to it. In one gene, so we know, Jay, that having one opsin means you can't differentiate color. See, so Moose asks, is the opsin gene or lack thereof affect all. So there are options for detecting certain wavelengths. So it's not one that detects all wavelengths, it's one that detects a particular wavelength. If you have one of them, the way it functions is it's contrast. So two different wavelengths can be detected by two different opsons, and you need those to be able to see in color. If you only have the one, you're not differentiating between anything, and so you will not have color vision, which is what snakes have. Snakes don't have that ability to differentiate because they've lost a lot of their opsons over evolutionary time, except the sea snakes, which have had a genome duplication event giving them the ability to see green and yellow wavelengths, and therefore they can differentiate between those two. I'm not aware of anything that's looked at or demonstrated if there is a number of neurons to have an ability to see a certain color. I don't think there's that much depth to it yet, in the sense of going through one neuron to one color, and like what neuron and like is traced and activates within the brain for a particular color. So it's not necessarily that you need a certain set of nerves to see each color. It's that you need this certain kind of opson to be able to tell this color from a different color. And that's not necessarily neuron dependent, like of how many you have, but rather if you have that opson present. And usually the opsons are loaded into one of those retinal cells, which then are processed into the brain. Presumably, Jay, there's like a threshold of how many neurons you need expressing a certain type of opson, so that you have a mix of opsons and you have a mix of neurons. There maybe is a threshold in numbers, but I'm not sure if anyone has looked at it on that level. Like, I hope the gene only does eye cell stuff. Yeah, so Morris, with genetic tricks that we can do now, there is the ability. What you would do is inject the embryo and transform it to contain your new gene of interest. And you would presumably put it right next to the existing gene that the snakes already have. Remember, we talked about that it was a duplication event of a certain gene. So you can stick it in a particular location. That's one of the ways that you can have it so.
This is true.
Thank you, Bryce. That those unexpected side effects don't necessarily happen. Infrared sensing organs, they have less of the opsin genes. So per this paper, they compared the genomes of these sea snakes that were in this area of the world around Indonesia to modern day terrestrial snakes as well. There, they did not find that this type of opsin set of genes. They found the evolutionary ancestor of the gene. Like, it was clear that it was a gene duplication event, but that one opsin was just alone in the terrestrial snakes that they looked at. Now, that does not mean that there's not a terrestrial snake out there that doesn't have this, like, didn't have then an evolved extra set of opsins. The ones that were looked at on. And so that is presumably the trade-off. I wonder, Moo, when they went into why this evolved. If you can see infrared because you're in a dark area, right? Probably because you're in a dark area, so your color vision really doesn't help as much. And then again, we don't know why the color vision re-evolved in these sea snakes. I like Neil's hypothesis about the coral reefs that they're in are very colorful, or Draw Curiosity mentioned about sexual selection on top of, the coral reefs where these animals are hanging out. But those are such hypotheses where there's nothing backing them up beyond just total guesswork, right? They themselves mentioned that there needs to be actual behavioral testing on there to be able to be done. Like there was no behavioral testing, right? That is, and so these are just hypotheses we're putting forth. That is going to be their follow-up paper. It also kind of makes sense. Again, the journal this was published in, it's like a genome biology journal. And so that's all that they're kind of going into is genome, genetics, the sequencing in particular, and not the behavioral side of things. I think had they done the follow-up experiment, or like the one that Jay asked, taking the gene and putting it into a snake that can't see color, that's the next step, right? If you can pull that off where the gene is necessary, so take a sea snake that has the gene, get rid of it, mutate the gene and get rid of it. Does the sea snake no longer see color, right? You would guess maybe, if the hypothesis is right. And then give that gene to a land snake that doesn't have it. Now it doesn't see color, showing necessary and sufficient. Those would be like the home run experiments if they worked. I could tell you 10 different reasons why it wouldn't work, and that wouldn't invalidate the hypothesis. And one of those is how Jay was saying, is that maybe just the nervous system isn't built to detect it. Even if you put in the color seeing gene into a rattlesnake, what is it going to do? Not going to see. Different ability to see by the sea snake because thermal imaging would not be effective. Maybe, Miss Caprikel. Maybe. There was, I say maybe, is that I think it's an interesting hypothesis, but there was no analysis and breaking down of it in the study. Like there was not an examination of those possibilities, if that makes sense. They were just like, here is the finding, here is the gene duplication event, here is what it does, then, and that's that. So maybe all of these could be possibilities there. And yeah, and Miss Caprikel, what I liked about it, the study, is at the end of it, they say that we need more data. We need to have behavioral data that actually looks at this. And they're like, until we do not know why this evolved. And we do not know the functional significance of it. Lizards do see in color, Jay. So that's what was really cool, is if you look at the evolutionary timing of it, their ancestors, snakes' ancestors, which they evolved from lizards, see color. Snakes don't. So they must have lost the ability to see that color from their ancestors, the lizards. And then that's why these sea snakes are so weird, because they regained the ability to see color, right? That's what really got me like excited about this study, because it's an example of, like, we've talked a lot about gene loss studies or even a gene gain study, but this is an example where they can list out, like, in evolutionary time, this is where these animals lost color vision, and oh look, these have regained it now. Like, it's just really, really cool. So it's different enough, Jay, where they can tell it's not the lizard copy. It's not that that these snakes just happen to be really, really as a weird evolutionary fluke, and they just so happen to have evolved or maintained it. Instead, it's clearly a gene duplication event where the structure and sequence of the existing opsin gene is so similar that it's just a copy pasta with some mutations in it. So while the function is very similar to what the lizards have, sequence-wise, it's different. So again, y'all, just a little bit of a recap on the Science News story that we just talked about. They found 9 species of sea snake that have regained the genetic ability to have advanced color vision. Again, why that's cool, it's a lost complex trait that has been regained over evolutionary time. And that's the big takeaway of this paper. Really, really exciting stuff. I think a game changer in terms of being able to outline how evolutionary effects ended up happening. Publication referenced other papers where they had identified other sea snakes that had gotten this visual function back. And so they went through, they did a bunch more deep sequencing. They did a retinal transcriptome comparison to see how the retina are different between these. And they even then talked to hypothesize a little bit about the evolution of these things.